Gretchen here on the call is going to keep track of the questions. And at the back end of the panel discussion, we're going to do a little roundtable Q&A. So, folks, I'm going to kick this off. This is going to be directed both to Charlie and Christopher. So we're going to start off with those two gentlemen first. So over the past several years, there's been a growing concern about the cost of housing overall. While there are many influences to this, what we want to talk a little bit about today is the overall influence of affordable housing on zoning and land use regulations, and what are those barriers. So anyway, Charlie and Christopher, let's talk a little bit about barriers, about what you guys are seeing at the local level, as I tend to call it, what can we do to change red tape to green tape? So Charlie, since you're top of my screen, I'm going to start with you. Why don't you jump in and tell us what you think about that?
Well, it's a complex equation, Keith, and there's a lot of factors that go into making something affordable, many of which we just don't control locally. There's things like material pricing and what a house costs, and there are other things like land availability, constricted land supply. But there's a particular aspect, I think, that's something we can talk about here, that is something we do control. And it's not something that's a comfortable thing to think about, because in part, we as a community really do this to ourselves. We intentionally, through our comprehensive plans and zoning ordinances, limit the supply of land for new homes. We intentionally, as a community, limit the density of new homes that is allowed on any one piece of land. And that's not a judgment on those things. Those are the reasonable things to do as a community, but they do constrain our supply of housing. Albemarle, for example, only allows residential housing development of any scale in 5% of the county, preserving the other 95% as rural. That's great. We love our rural lands, but it has impacts. So, I mean, when you think about supply and demand, it's kind of a nebulous concept with housing for most people. But, think about if you really take it down to a very small scale and think of if there's 5 homes available and 10 buyers, who's going to get them? It's going to be the 5 people of those 10 who have the most money, and they are going to drive the cost of that home purchase up. And the inverse is true. If you have 10 homes available and only 5 buyers, those 10 homeowners who are selling, or 10 builders, if it's new houses, are going to compete by driving prices down to try to sell to those 5 buyers. So limiting supply really impacts the affordability of houses. There's a lot of other things I can talk about, but I'll pause for a minute, and I know Chris has some great thoughts on it too.
Chris, if you could share some thoughts on that, but for more specifically, how do you think the zoning codes impact affordable housing from your perspective?
Is that question to me, Keith?
Yes, I'm sorry, Christopher. I apologize.
Well, it's a form of control over supply that Charlie's mentioning, but there's a lot of layers that are included in the zoning or other regulations, like the subdivision ordinance and things like that are included. I sort of think of as included as part of zoning, but a lot of people wonder why we can't produce housing for the same relative cost that we could 50 or even 30 years ago, when I talked to my grandparents or even my parents, and they could buy a home for $30,000 or $80,000 or $100,000. Well, in Charlottesville, a lot costs over $100,000, and a lot of that is driven by zoning and other regulation. So you limit the supply so that the demand goes up for a limited amount of inventory, but then there's a lot of things that have been layered into the cost of production as a result of those ordinances as well. So those older neighborhoods that cost less to build, and so an investor could sell those units for less,
So it brings up an interesting part, Christopher. So our next session we're going to have is actually a development performer. So hopefully the folks that are on this webinar can join us back to maybe put a little bit of context to what Christopher and Charlie are talking about, which is the cost of development that unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how one looks at it, conveys itself down to the price. That's part of understanding why the developer can't produce something at a certain price point. But Andrew, I'm going to switch a little bit over to you. As a policy director for the state, and everybody on this call probably knows we're a Dillon rule state. What are you seeing at the state level that are some of the biggest barriers to affordable housing from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Keith, and thanks everybody for joining in and for having me. The items that Charlie and Chris mentioned, really, we hear about that from virtually every locality where we have members, and obviously to varying degrees and different kind of fashions. But I think universally, and one of the things we've focused on at the state level, outside of the zoning and local issues, is really just the increasingly more complex nature of actually financing mixed income or affordable housing developments. The days of kind of just traditional debt financing, going to the bank and getting the loan, the amount of money that our members can get to actually finance those projects doesn't come close to actually the cost of development and construction. And that's across the board. I think my introduction mentioned my involvement in the Better Housing Coalition, which is a nonprofit developer, and they have virtually the same issues, a lot of the same issues that our members have when it comes to land use, but really when it comes down to the financing. And so, looking at that side of it, this past session, we really focused on a bill to establish a state low-income housing tax credit, or a housing opportunity tax credit. And that's really one of the most effective ways, it's probably the best way to actually get units onto the ground. And it helps fill that gap of what I was referring to earlier about the debt financing, the traditional ways of getting a project moving, and what it actually takes to get the project built out of the ground. The other big issue that we hear a lot about, not to replicate what Charlie and Chris mentioned, but we actually get a lot of notes from localities talking about what tools are available to incentivize affordable housing development. And even though I think we like to think that everybody's up to date with every provision of the Virginia Code, the reality is everybody's got a lot going on. And so that's a real struggle, I think, for both our members who, in Richmond, tax abatements are a huge driver of redevelopment and revitalization and housing. And other localities out in the Valley, those are kind of concepts they're still exploring. So I guess to really sum that up is one of the big impediments for our members and local governments is just awareness of what tools are actually available to them to help kind of bend the cost curve.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'm going to try to bring it back local to Christopher and Charlie. So what do you believe, and this is kind of an emotional question, but do you believe that the current regulations reflect the local values of our region? And I'll let either one of you two gentlemen jump in. I want to tackle it first. So the question is do you think the current zoning regulations, zoning ordinances reflect our local values? I know that's a bit of a tough question to answer, so I'd love you guys to try to take a stab at it.
Gosh, Keith, I think it depends who you ask. There are lots of people in our region who want it to stay just like it is. They would be thrilled if not another new person ever moved here. And for that matter, if the people who lived here didn't have children and increase the population. People are kind of naturally reluctant to embrace change. I think that's a human nature thing. But then there's another segment of our local population that really is clamoring for change. It has been stuck in ways that have not been serving people who need other housing options for too long. There's a lot of wealth in our community, but that wealth is not uniformly distributed across the community. And so people at some levels are feeling left out of the enjoyment that other people get here. So I guess the answer is no, from my point of view. Our regulations currently, I think, are more skewed toward protecting the way it is here rather than embracing the change that is needed to actually provide more housing options for more people. And so we really need to kind of look hard in the mirror as a community as to whether we fully embrace providing more housing options for people. And that's not just at the comprehensive planning level or at the zoning ordinance level. That has to go all the way down to the very small technical policies, standards, specifications that cities and counties publish that everybody has to follow, because that's where the cost really is. We have these layers of documents that are, the comprehensive plan is a philosophical document. The ordinances that fall underneath that comprehensive plan are legal documents. Then below that are standards and specs that are technical documents. And even below that is how the individual approval agencies and individual reviewers interpret those standards and specs. Now, those last two, the standards and the interpretations, are really where the decisions are made. But that's not something that we ever talk about as a community. Nobody in this community, save for a few very select insiders who have technical knowledge, pay attention to those documents. But that is where the actual impact is.
That's those layers where the street trees and the stormwater and the width of roads and sidewalks and the the off-site nutrient credits and things like that all come into play, and every one of those items has an impact on a project or and adds cost in a lot of cases. But a thought that I had to add to what Charlie was talking about is my view is that zoning anywhere is it is a reflection of the community because it's adopted by the community, and an elected board often is tasked with setting that policy and then driving down towards those smaller minutia that Charlie referred to, and they're hard to move and they're hard to change. So the zoning we have today is a reflection of a period of time that we had in this area, and those zoning ordinances in the city of Charlottesville, and I think in Albemarle as well, are a little outdated, and we're having that conversation now. How do we update them to solve today's problems? But it still is a conversation that there's no consensus, about how we deal with this problem. I'm just this past 12 months, we've seen projects in Albemarle County from Breezy Hill to Parkway Place to the 29 North apartments that were discussed, the RTD project it's called last week, to the Hollymead project. Every single one of those, you see it, very publicly goes through this neighborhood process and this public input process, and almost to a person we're hearing, our neighborhood, I believe in affordable housing, but we really don't want it right here. We'd rather have it somewhere else, put it in a different spot. And so it becomes this death by a thousand cuts. And at some point we have to have some tough conversations as a community. How do we want to solve that problem? Where are we going to designate areas that we want to develop in a way that allows the price of housing to come down and more supply to come on, and things like that, and allows more people to move into this growing area. The alternative is just that we grow less dense and with a wider footprint, and that has a lot of other externalities, environmental and traffic related, and even inequality in some cases. And so there's just it's sort of a business of trade-offs when we're talking about zoning.
You know, Christopher, I've been doing this for over 3 decades. That's really the best explanation I've ever heard about zoning ordinances reflecting in a snapshot of time, because it's a very public process, as you know, the comprehensive plan. And I see Neil Williams is watching, so he'll correct me if I'm wrong. But I believe every 5 years a jurisdiction needs to go through this for that very reason. It's a reflection of what the community wants to see. So great answer, Charlie. Yours was great too, but that resonated with me personally. So Andrew, I'm going to switch things over to you. And again, you know, you're the state guy, so we're kind of looking a little bit more at the state level for you. But what do you see the role of the public sector in affordable housing?
And just to clarify, by public sector, you mean at the General Assembly level or just local governments?
Well, I think we can take it whichever approach that you want. I think the intent of the question is probably more at a macro level. Yeah. As we said earlier, we're a Dillon rule state, so that it's pretty much comes from the top down. So, yeah. But whichever direction you prefer to take on it, we're good with it.
That's a scary thought to give me a free runway, but I think
time's up. Bye-bye.
I've had shorter cutoffs. I think at the state level, really, I mentioned the affordable housing opportunity tax credit, things like the housing trust fund. Those are really key parts of helping to fill the gap in what it takes to get a project going. So not to always say, well, it just is subsidies and tax credits and things like that. But at the end of the day, with the rising costs of land and materials and labor and everything else that we cannot control at the General Assembly level, those things actually get units onto the ground, and they do it relatively quickly. So I think that's a really key part of that. So I encourage everybody, a little plug for us, to keep pushing on the Housing Trust Fund and programs like the Housing Opportunity Tax Credit. Kind of moving into more statutory things, I think working with David at the TJPDC and other local governments, the kind of discussions that localities, planning district commissions, and our industry can have, over the course of a year leading up to the General Assembly session, instead of talking to each other 2 weeks before session about ideas. Those things, I think, those conversations are incredibly helpful. I mean, David's given me a lot of insight and kind of feedback about what's going on in your region, which has helped revise some of the way I think about things. We had discussions about ADU ordinances during the 2020 session. So, I think those kind of conversations need to continue occurring. What can we do to make tax abatement programs, ADU ordinances, fee waivers, and other kind of statutory and enabling authorities either more lucrative, more effective, more modern? We've got a lot of statutes on the books that are 15, 20 years old, and they've never been revamped. So at the local level, having been involved with our Richmond home builders, where we were dealing with localities every day. General Assembly was kind of a distant thing for us. It sounds really rudimentary, but I think having these discussions are really effective, and not just doing it one time a year, but really kind of keeping the dialogue open, not necessarily just about, affordable housing incentives, but what can we do to offset, like I mentioned, the rising price of land, labor, whether it's through process improvements, stormwater requirements, all those different things that contribute to the cost of a project, and just constantly have a feedback loop between industry and local governments. I'll plug my friends in Chesterfield County. They would do meetings, probably 6 times a year, just saying, what can we do to improve and streamline things? And I think those are the kind of discussions that really the public sector can drive and bring our members to the table on, that really do go a long way to kind of, I think, putting a light on some of the issues that may sit in the darkness a little bit.
Well, Andrew, you got my attention with the ADU, auxiliary dwelling unit discussion. I'm part of a national cohort where we're trying to unify the ordinances throughout or the rules around the country. So offline one day we ought to have a conversation about that. But it's interesting. What comes to mind in this conversation is a little bit about the difference between NIMBYism and NIMBYism, right? NIMBYism is not my backyard. NIMBYism is yes in my backyard, and maybe that's I'm probably getting a little bit off a script here. That's probably a conversation for a later session on what those two mean and what kind of impacts it might have. As the whole intent of the regional housing partnership is to bring everybody together from the different pillars of what I call a healthy housing system, which is the private sector, which is the conversation we're having now in the public sector and the folks that we serve in the nonprofit sector. But we're running up close to the end of our panel portion, getting ready to go into the Q&A session portion of it. So just a bit of a roundtable, and we'll start with you, Charlie. Those who are watching, what would you want the one takeaway to be in this short little conversation we're having? So one little tidbit of information that could get a light bulb started in somebody's head that's on this conversation.
Well, the biggest thing that I see is that a lot of times we're hearing the problems with things, and we're not looking toward the solutions. So if there's one takeaway, I think we really need to focus on the things that get us to yes, to the things that get us to a more inclusionary zoning ordinance. Right now, the zoning ordinance we have is exclusionary by its design. When you're looking at large lot residential zoning, that excludes a lot of the population who just cannot afford large lots and large houses, and that's not what people need. So getting to a place where we can say yes to things that might be smaller, things that might be denser, things that might be appropriate where the need is, instead of focusing on the problems, instead of worrying about making everything perfect, we need to get to this is 90% great and get to yes.
Christopher, same question.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and I think it would be helpful for folks generally in the conversation to understand that everybody has to kind of come to the table to solve the problem. We can't regulate our way out of this. There's no amount of government subsidy that's going to solve this problem from one municipality or one state government or the federal government. And there's the taxpayers will need to be involved at some level, because what we're asking for, what we're trying to provide is something that's not possible to build economically at certain income levels, and there has to be a way to make up that gap. Part of it can be by more supply and more approvals of housing, but that's only going to get us so far. And so I just think what I always try to find in the situations that get kind of sticky are, let's find ways to work together instead of let's find ways to kind of throw mud and make it somebody else's problem. So I think the communities, the governments, the developers, and the neighborhoods all need to come together and try to solve this if we really care about it.
Andrew, you want to tackle that from your perspective?
Yeah, kind of in line with what Chris was just talking about. I think really the biggest takeaway is there's a really strong need to break down the silos in different groups that are involved in this. I feel like we've got local governments, housing advocates / affordable housing advocates, and then market rate builders, developers, and local governments are trying to figure out what it takes to get a builder to do affordable housing. The advocates are somewhere in between. Builders are trying to figure out why local governments won't listen, or something like that. Everybody's kind of ships passing in the night. And we've had some discussions with other groups about affordable housing, and they're shocked to hear that, from our members' perspective, they really want to be engaged on things like affordable dwelling units and LIHTC. And so I guess really the takeaway is that market rate builders, developers, affordable housing developers, they're allies in the discussion. I feel like we just need to kind of open those lines of conversation a little bit, and builders need to listen to local governments a little bit more and kind of understand their pain and their challenges, and vice versa. Having done state stuff and local stuff, I can tell you everyone kind of goes into their own camps and tries to figure out what the other's thinking. But I think we can get a whole lot more done if people kind of just sit down and work through things.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is kind of why we pushed the creation of the Central Virginia Regional Housing Partnership. The one word that came to mind in your three responses is communication. We need to communicate in a way that everybody understands it, in the way that maybe the private sector or your side of the table might communicate or understand something one way, the other side of the table, let's say the public sector, may not quite understand it. So that's the intent of these discussions that we're having, is to help this cross understanding. We've got a couple of questions in there, but I'm going to take a little bit of liberty here to ask a question of my own from you three gentlemen. So the second thing I heard was less is more, right? Less units increase the pricing. Is that a flawed thinking on my end, folks? Anybody want to jump in?
No, absolutely. I mean, you're a bigger house on a larger lot with more landscaping and a wider sidewalk and a bigger road with more infrastructure costs a hell of a lot more than say a tiny house on a lot that is appropriate for that size of dwelling.
So Charlie, I'm going to take that question and twist it around a little bit differently towards you. Putting emotions aside, just looking at this from a production perspective, one who produces product. Do you like this missing middle concept, or is that something that you and your firm would explore if it was available?
Yeah.
And explain missing middle with your understanding of it.
Well, so missing middle means kind of a broad swath of things, but essentially it's housing that is neither subsidized by government and isn't public housing or the lower end of the affordability scale, and it isn't the market rate housing. It's the stuff that the market can't produce and the governments have no subsidy for. So generally what people think of when we talk of missing middle is like a sixplex small apartment building, or row houses like you might see in Philadelphia or places like that. These are smaller houses or houses that are denser that can accommodate more people, more families in the same space as, say, one single family house. That's missing middle. And yes, absolutely. Southern Development would love to be able to produce those kinds of things. There just aren't places to produce them.
You're not allowed to.
Not allowed to by the ordinances, right? There are very few places. It's either multifamily zoning or single family zoning, or you have to create your own zoning, which brings in a whole slew of additional layers of regulatory process, which many developers avoid because of the uncertainty and cost associated with those processes. So we need to put that missing middle into our zoning ordinances and remove the barriers that exist in our current ordinances to it.
Andrew, I'm going to bounce over to you here. Everybody knows on this call, cost of construction is going through the roof substantially. How can local and state governments help support the developers in that realm? I mean, this is your wheelhouse. This is what you advocate every day of the week.
I guess that kind of goes back to the earlier question about kind of what is the public sector's role in that. Kind of, I don't know if this is a direct answer to your question, but as Chris was talking, this kind of came to mind. I think kind of the idea of shrinking, trying to make it easier to do denser products, but also maintain some open space and shrink lot sizes and things like that. Cluster ordinances in some localities have been really effective in helping the developer maintain costs, but increase density in a way that also addresses adjacent communities' concerns with kind of too much growth. And so I think, kind of stepping back a little bit, just looking at ways to modernize the zoning ordinances. We spent a lot of time in the city of Richmond, which until a couple of years ago had Scott's Addition as a low-rise industrial area with no economic development activity. I think that's exactly what was in the zoning ordinance and the comp plan, and it had been decades since that had been revised, and we had gone back, worked with the city to increase density and make sure there was some kind of future outlook for that neighborhood as development activity was picking up. So I don't want to sound repetitive on my previous answer, but I feel like Charlie and Chris really kind of covered, it goes back to communication, just kind of sitting down and really trying to look where we're going to be in 5 years, 10 years, where we want to be, and trying to refresh some of those really important documents at the local level to reflect those goals.
Thank you, Andrew. Gretchen, I'm reading through some of these questions and I'm kind of formulating or regurgitating them a little bit and formulating some questions, but if I'm missing something because I can't see it, please jump in and read the question to me. We were talking, this is for all three of you guys, and whoever wants to jump in on it, please do. I mentioned the word NIMBYism and NIMBYism. One of the questions in the feed was, how do you think we can combat NIMBYism? Whoever wants to jump in on that. Great question, guys.
I'm happy to go. I think I wrote it down because it's actually a great question. I think it was Debbie's question, or Debbie had a question that was similar to that. I think a lot of that kind of goes to dispelling the myths about what affordable housing is, or, we talk a lot about affordable housing, or we try to find some term for it. And we talk about the structure itself and what it's made out of and what kind of landscaping there is and infrastructure. I think what would really help in that effort is start focusing more on the actual people that are potentially served by that new development. There's so much discussion about the development itself, but not the fact that almost everybody in their life, unless they were served a pretty good lot up front, graduated from school or came out of high school and was looking for their first apartment or house. And not everybody can buy a 5,000 square foot house just right out the gate. And I think that's missed on a lot of people. You see a lot of communities say, well, we don't want a LIHTC project or an ADU project. And they have some kind of misperception about the people that are in there, but we've all been at that point. And so I don't know how we do that, but we get so lost sometimes on the planning side of it and discussions about buildings, we lose kind of sight of the people that will be there at some point. I think that's what we need to look at. These are everybody on this call. So
I think education, communication is important. And I also think political will is important. You have a lot of times a small community of the loudest voices will sort of strong arm their opinion into a vote at a municipal board level. And I've seen this happen in various different jurisdictions. And that's because it's a group of voters that are educated and they have time to fight that battle. The people that are going to use the project in the future aren't there. They're a non-existent voice, although they are a stakeholder, but pretty tough to identify and give them the power. So it becomes a developer versus a neighborhood. And there's ways politically to override that. It's just becomes kind of risky if you're in the seat, having to cast a vote that goes against a group of constituents. So there is very much a political element to this, and you can eliminate even that by doing proper, in-depth community engaged planning and comprehensive planning, long range planning, small area planning up front, and then codifying that via the zoning ordinance. That's how a community's voice can really get, I think, put into action. But without that, we just have a series, every project becomes a battle.
I want to reinforce what Chris just said, because that's so important. And I know some local politicians are listening, or hopefully will hear about this. The people who we hear from at public meetings when it's a project-based meeting are the people who have time, often are the people who are educated and have other luxuries that the people who need housing don't have. So we don't hear from the people who need the housing because they're at work, or they're raising their children, or cooking dinner. They don't come to these meetings because their life takes priority and they're just trying to get through that day or that week. And so we hear from the people who are the haves. We don't hear from the have-nots. And we need to understand that when we say, oh, well, this project had 10 people speak against it and only 2 people speak in favor of it. That is not representative.
That's a great point, Charlie.
So Gretchen just sent me a direct message. I believe B has her hand up. So if you would like to ask your question, that would be great. You can unmute yourself, or whoever will unmute her.
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Okay, so you don't have, I don't know if you want my video. Oh, you may not want to see me.
Oh, come on now.
But the reason, and thank you very much for doing this. I'm late to joining this, but this is very, very good. I was just about to send something to Chris and Charlie to say, what about relabeling it to workforce housing, and emphasizing that the workforce housing means our teachers, police officers, firefighters. That would be a much more difficult battle for people to, to go against, the community to go against, if you say we're doing housing so that our teachers, firefighters, police officers can live here.
I think that's super important, B. I catch myself, I correct myself sometimes even talking about it, where you can't lump this whole issue into one label of affordable housing. And the risk there is that a lot of people by default assume that what you mean by affordable housing is public housing, and that has all sorts of connotations from the past. And it's way more, there's way more nuance to it. And I think vocabulary is important. Right. That's part of the education process. And I think that's one of the, from my perspective, a major mission of the Regional Housing Partnership is to help have these conversations and get some of that information out there.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. I'm going to pick it up from here if you don't mind, B. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So what Christopher doesn't know is that's on our agenda to start tackling the definition. That's been on my agenda for 3 years of trying to get that up to the point that let's define this from a regional perspective, what affordable housing means to what region and not, and workforce housing, because it means different things to different people. B, thank you so much for that question. Let me see if I can buzz through this and jump into a couple other questions. Again, we have a strong 15 minutes left. If you do want to ask a live question, just raise your hand and Gretchen will remind me to call on you. So let me see, Gretchen, am I missing some questions here? Let's see what we've got here. I'm going to read Ethan Tate's question verbatim because I don't want to get it wrong. And then I'm going to throw this out there. It's what peer communities around the country and population demand, et cetera, have done a good job with this, especially with regard to racial justice and preventing marginalized communities of color from bearing the brunt of density and redevelopment while preserving white neighborhoods as is. It's a high level question, but I think what we're probably talking a little bit about is gentrification. And it's a big question, guys. Who would like to try to tackle that from their perspective? Oh boy.
Go ahead, Charlie.
I don't know that we're going to have a great answer for this, but we've got 400 years of American history to overcome here. Ibrahim Samira, who's a delegate in House of Delegates in Virginia, kind of did a great analytical article on this recently, and everybody talks about recently in Minneapolis having changed their zoning ordinance to essentially get rid of the concept of single family housing. That is one solution they are trying. We don't know yet if it's going to be effective. We're just starting to turn this into a new way of thinking, because for the past, I'd say 50 years, we've been thinking of zoning as the solution. Restrictive zoning is the solution. So I don't know there's an answer. I hope somebody has one, but I think we're in the point of trying things and seeing what works right now.
Charlie, I can add to that perspective a little bit. I was part of what's happening out in Portland and Seattle and Oregon and Washington, where they did the same thing as in Minneapolis. To be clear, they did not get rid of single family detached. They just allowed, you could put up to 4 or 6 units depending on jurisdiction, these units. That is the so-called missing middle solution to that. And you know, I don't know, like you're right, I don't know how that's going to play out, but they're substantially doing something. It's very interesting. That part of the world started this NIMBYism thing, and you would expect that part of the world to be against increased density. They were actually for it. Christopher, you want to tackle something on this, or should we move on?
Yeah, just one other community that I'd like to follow, because I think they've done a really strong job in their planning department and working with their neighborhood groups to craft small area plans and roll them into a comprehensive plan, is Nashville. And I know folks in Charlottesville might recoil at the thought of ever becoming a Nashville, but that's not the point. The point is they've done some really good planning in conjunction with their local communities and neighborhoods to jointly arrive at what they think is an appropriate solution. And they got really close to adding a major transit plan as a component of that. It was voted down at referendum, but I think they'll keep trying. So Mark Bernhardt was the planning director down there. They have some really great comprehensive and small area plans that are done, and I encourage folks to go read through some of that. It adds some very, I think, appropriate soft density in a lot of the historical neighborhoods around the downtown that are similar to what we have in land use patterns here in Charlottesville.
And I'll just add real quick, if I could, to Charlie's point earlier. I think really the key to a lot of that, I don't know if there's a community that does it really well, but is kind of lifting up some of the voices from communities who aren't able to attend a 6:30 p.m. city council meeting or a board meeting or a planning commission meeting, and give them more opportunities to help shape their community or push back against some of the vocal minority of quote unquote NIMBYs. That I think is really, really key to helping make development patterns a little more equitable.
So,
Keith,
yes.
I have someone who has sent me a question that is not in the main chat.
Okay, sure.
It's from Hamilton, I think it's Lombardi. He said, new home construction in the metro area over the last decade, about 11,500, appears to have kept up with population growth, about 21,000. If total housing supply isn't a problem, why does our region have the state's most expensive housing relative to income after Northern Virginia?
Interesting question. So the question is why is our cost of housing so expensive? Does that sound about right? The short version of it? I think that's what we've been.
As compared to Northern Virginia, yes.
Got it, yeah. So I think that's what we were talking about today, and that was the purpose of this discussion about is the zoning or is the governmental regulations impeding that. So I'll let either one of you gentlemen or three gentlemen jump in on trying to tackle that question.
From my perspective, it's probably twofold, and I'll repeat the question to make sure I understand it, but it sounds like the gentleman is illustrating with some facts that there's not a supply-demand imbalance because housing supply is keeping up with population growth. But that hasn't been what I've seen in my development experience here in Charlottesville. There's people that would be moving into this area, but they can't afford to live here because they're outcompeted for the supply of housing with folks that can't afford to live here. So a retiree moving from Northern Virginia, for example. has a lot larger budget for a home than a young professional trying to find a job in Charlottesville that might want to live here. Some of those folks are pushed out to areas like Stanton, Waynesboro, Palmyra, Richmond, and those aren't picked up in the MSA stats necessarily. And the other thing I think we do is we regulate our ordinances incentivize design and aesthetics and larger lot, bigger homes that cost more to produce. So they have to be sold for more. I think those two things were in conjunction, would lead, to the higher cost that we're seeing.
So we only got, Charlie, just to put a little timeline to this, we only have a few more minutes left before we're gonna have to wrap this up. So we got about 3 or 4 minutes before we start our closing summary wrap up. So go ahead, Charlie.
That question is an interesting perspective, and I want to think about this a little bit more, because housing supply and population are always going to keep pace. That's just how it is. The thing that changes is the price. People don't move here to be homeless. So unless there's a home, they're not coming. Or unless they come, there won't be a home. And there's some cyclical relationship there. But to say that housing supply has kept up with population does not say anything. It only says that people live in houses. So the price is what we need to look at when we're evaluating whether housing supply has kept up with the demand.
I think Andrew can add a little bit of perspective to this. I can add my own from a national perspective, from the great housing depression or bubble. I believe nationwide builders were producing about 2 million units. It went to about 400. We're somewhere around 1.2 or something like that now. Charlie, are we, from your perspective, are we keeping up with the production versus need? I think I know the answer to that question, but
You know the answer to that question. It's no.
Yeah.
How about you, Andrew?
There's very few parts of the Commonwealth where production's keeping up with demand. It's interesting. We've had this discussion at the General Assembly, especially when COVID hit, and we were talking about relief and things like that. A lot of people drive down the street and they'll see a new neighborhood popping up of 50 homes, and their perception becomes, oh, well, these houses, we got houses exploding everywhere. We're just totally fine. You look at the numbers, whether it's from our national association or affordable housing advocates at the national level, and even some of the executive branch and other levels of government, they almost all say that supply is lagging and has been lagging for years, which has just continued to compound year over year the pressures on price. So I'm not in Charlottesville, but having looked at a lot of data from across the state, the supply-demand imbalance is pretty strong.
So we're coming up with about 1 more minute left in here, folks. This is the success of this conversation is the comments in the feed, right? There's a ton of comments in it and questions that we just simply don't have enough time to get to. So if I didn't take your question or ask a portion of your question, it wasn't because I didn't want to. We're running out of time here. So first and foremost, I want to thank everybody for putting some of those questions in the feed. And I just don't think I've got anything in that feed that we can tackle in less than 30 seconds on it. So I just wanted to thank everybody in the participation to put it in that. We will take the opportunity to read those and maybe we'll reach out and try to do some written response. But so it looks like we've got about 5 minutes to wrap up from closing. So personally, I wanted to thank Charlie, Andrew, and Christopher. I know you guys got a pretty busy schedule, and to sit here and have a conversation with us remotely means the world to me personally. And I just wanted to say thank you for all your input. Any last second closing comments that you might want to make before we move on to the last few minutes of our presentation or our webinar? Anybody want to jump in real quick?
I'll just kind of say, as the out of town guy, anybody on the call, whether it's PDC or local government folks, or just really anybody, our association's here to kind of work in partnership. Obviously, we focus at the General Assembly level, but really we can't do anything effectively if we don't hear from folks on the ground. So for anybody that's willing to take us up on that, please feel free to reach out, whether it's on affordable housing or environmental issues. We love hearing about what's going on in specific markets. So thanks for having a non-Charlottesville guy on the call.
Thank you, gentlemen. So I think either Gretchen or Susan or Stacy's going to pull in. I think they're going to show some of the upcoming series that we have going on, because it's not on my notes, so I don't have them verbatim. So if somebody can jump in and talk a little bit about the next session we have coming up. You want to tackle that, Stacy, for me, please?
I believe Gretchen has all the answers instead of me.
Gretchen, you've got all the answers as usual, Gretchen. There we go. There's a slide.
This is Lucinda. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks Keith and to all the presenters and to Chris Henry for sponsoring this event. So we have 3 more events coming up, and the next one is on affordable housing pro forma. So it's about how how to finance affordable housing and the hurdles you have to go through.
It'll put context to what we've been talking about today.
Yeah. So, and then there was also a question about transportation and housing. So we also have a session on that in May, on May 20th. There's links to these slides, and there's a web page where you can register for the events. So we hope to see you at the next events as well.
So thank you everybody. Thank you for your input on this, and thank you. I want to take a minute while we've got a minute left on this. I want to reach out to the commission staff and the Regional Housing Partnership staff. First of all, just to put up with me is, an undertaking. But these folks put a ton of effort, ton of work in it. We throw ideas out them, and they produce and turn out some great product like we're watching today and they're communicating today. So if you have an opportunity offline, send a note, say thank you. That goes a long way to producing some great product, which is what we're doing right now. So I think at this point, unless somebody else in Regional Housing Partnership have anything to add, I think we're about done. We're wrapping up for today. Does anybody have anything to add from the staff level? Hearing none.
I'm good.
Hearing none. I want to thank everybody again, particularly Christopher, Andrew, and Charlie. Thanks for coming out here and having a chat with us here for an hour.
Thanks for having us, Keith.
See you later, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
I think I got this right. Lucinda, you want to stay on for a minute, please?
Yeah, I'm gonna